Chapter 2 talks about how do we measure delinquency. We have three major ways of doing this, and they're the same way we measure all crime, except that we're going to talk about some measurements that are specific to delinquency. So we have official statistics, which includes the UCR and NIBRS, self-report data, and victimization data. So primarily our official statistics come from the Uniform Crime Report. This is arrest data collected by the FBI from individual police departments, and it's compiled in the FBI's annual Crime in the United States, the Uniform Crime Reports. It provides various data on crime, mostly the number of crimes known to the police, cleared by arrest, and people arrested and characteristics of those arrested. This clearance data, which is the number of crimes cleared by arrest, so crimes that are considered solved because an arrest has occurred, and arrest data provide information on the extent of delinquency and trends in delinquency. So the UCR is divided into two parts, Part 1 and Part 2, and Part 1 is referred to as index crimes. Index crimes consist of 8 major crimes, 4 property, and 4 violent crimes. These are the relatively serious crimes and the things most people think about when they think of crime. Violent crimes are crimes against people, murder, rape, robbery, and assault. Property crimes include larceny, burglary, arson, and motor vehicle theft. Although arson data in the UCR is pretty limited, the best arson data is going to come from fire departments. So the FBI reports these crimes known to the police in clearance and arrest data. So remember, since this comes from police data, it's not going to include any information about crimes not known to the police. Anything that's not reported is not going to be in here. Part 2 has 20 additional offenses, and for this, there's no data on offenders or victims, just arrest data. So what do we know about juveniles? Well, only about 20% of crimes are cleared by arrest, so very little is known about the age of offenders in most crimes. We do, however, know that crime in general is committed by younger people, not necessarily teenagers, but younger people. In terms of actual numbers for arrests, white youth make up the majority of arrests, but black youths are overrepresented, so they are arrested at higher rates. We often use residence as a proxy for social class, but there's not enough information here to really be accurate. Females are accountable or responsible for about 25% of juvie arrests, and the same goes for adult arrests. Now, what's important here is that we want to be able to compare data from one jurisdiction to another, so we want to look at rates. Rates are going to be the number of offenses per 100,000 people in the population. So some advantages of these official statistics. Well, they represent about 95% of the population, and they can provide information on long-term trends. Because even though there are flaws with this, the flaws remain the same from year to year, so the trends should still be accurate. They provide moderately accurate measures of certain types of serious crime. And you can see here at the bottom there's kind of a hyperlink, so if you go to the actual slides on Blackboard and click on that, you can find some answers to some commonly asked questions about the UCR. Now, disadvantages. As I mentioned before, it doesn't account for what we call the dark figure of crime. Only about a third of all crime is reported to the police, and some crimes don't have victims. So we don't have all the information about all crimes committed. Furthermore, even when crimes are reported, a lot of times offenders are not caught. Suspected offenders are also often not arrested because police have discretion about whether or not to arrest, and there might not be enough evidence to convict somebody. Also, sometimes there are data entry errors here that will cause problems. So for instance, I've been looking at some data, not from the UCR, but from NIBRS, dealing with statutory rape. Okay, so that is sex that has occurred when someone is under the age of consent. And there are offenders and victims in there listed who are like 1 day old or a year old. Those are probably data entry mistakes. Someone probably meant to type 1 followed by another number, and instead 1 is what got entered. Police also sometimes distort crime data. They might unfound crime reports, say there's not enough information to substantiate it, or reclassify it from more or less serious categories. Also with the UCR, they follow a hierarchy rule, so only the most serious offense is reported. So if someone has committed multiple offenses in one criminal act, only the most serious one is reported. So this is also, by the way, what's called a summary. It's summary-based information, so you can't connect the offender to the victim in the data. So it greatly underestimates the extent of delinquency, especially minor delinquency, because most minor delinquency is not going to be reported. And it also may be misleading in estimating trends in delinquency. So things that could happen is you might see an uptick in numbers, and that might not be due to an actual uptick in crime. It could be due to an uptick in reporting. So some other places we could get some information could be from juvenile courts, okay? Keep in mind, though, that those are going to only include people who make it to the court stage, and so it's going to probably be more older youth. We can also get some data from juvenile correction facilities, but again, remember, these are only going to be juveniles who've been to court and been convicted and then been sentenced to a correctional facility. There are some racial differences here when we look at public versus private facilities, because private facilities could choose their clients. So they often choose wealthier clients, or wealthier clients can afford them. Public facilities focus more on delinquent offenders, whereas private ones focus on status offenders, kids who are abused, neglected, and people who might be there as a voluntary admission in order to work on their behavior. So another source of data here is self-report data. We can try to gauge how much delinquency someone's engaged in by asking them about it. So the methodology here is juveniles are asked about their delinquency, and it usually focuses on like the previous year, and they're generally anonymous or confidential. The major advantage here is that it's going to give us estimates of delinquency committed by juveniles. We can also ask questions about why they offended, how many times, and we could get more information, better information, because we can ask a whole series of questions about, we can ask demographic questions, we can ask them more about their backgrounds. Some examples include the Monitoring the Future survey. Okay, so this is done every year. I believe they interview 4th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders. They used to do it about a bunch of offenses, but this is focused more now on drug trends. There's a short 9 instrument and the National Youth Survey. So the National Youth Survey interviewed the same set of kids repeatedly over a period of time so that you can see how delinquency might be changing. They tell us that juveniles tend to commit less serious offenses than adults, that there tends to be little difference based on race, that there's a slightly greater number of lower class youths involved in crime, but the difference is small, and that males report higher rates than females. So what are some issues here? Well, truthfulness, right? How do we gauge whether or not, if we're doing a survey like this, someone's telling us the truth? Well, there's a variety of ways we can do this. So we can compare it with official records. We could interview peers, family, or school reports. You can use the lie detector. If you're asking about drug use, you can then compare it with drug tests. Research data tells us that these are moderately accurate and juveniles are reasonably honest. There's a minor level of underreporting for serious offenses. So it can be difficult to estimate trends here because there's very few long-term nationwide studies. So a lot of times these are a snapshot, one period of time. And they also are going to underestimate the extent of serious delinquency. First of all, because juveniles tend to underreport that, but also most of these surveys don't focus on that. They focus on minor offenses and have very vague response categories. They also undersample the most serious delinquents. So the most serious delinquents, a lot of these are done in school, and the most serious delinquents are also most likely to be out of school or skipping school, so they're not getting caught. We're not catching their data in these surveys. So some ways we can overcome this. Well, now they use a lot of computer-assisted surveys as opposed to like paper surveys. We are getting better at how we measure delinquency, so we can sample more juveniles. We can focus on minor and serious offenses. There's been more of an effort to get those trivial acts out of there, and to oversample juveniles in neighborhoods with high delinquency rates, so that you could try to catch some of those high-rate offenders. Our third source of data is victimization data. This works like self-report data, except you're asking people about their experience being victimized. So the most well-known one is the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and this is done by the federal government. And they sample households, and within the household, only people who are 12 and older. So we're not going to have anything about anyone under 12. They're asked if they've been victims of types of crimes, and then if they respond that they have, they're asked some follow-up questions about those offenses. They remain in the survey for 3 years, so they're interviewed a total of 7 times, once at the beginning and every 6 months after that. So again, this gives us some information on crimes reported and underreported, and tells us about the experiences of crime victims. So it focuses on only a few types of violent or property crimes. No information on drug use status offenses, crimes against businesses, and crimes against anyone under the age of 12. So it does also have a problem with undersampling some groups that have high rates of victimization. So some problems here. Crime victims may not report victimizations. It could be because they're embarrassed. They might not remember. If they've been victimized by someone they love, they might not want to report that. And sometimes for property crimes, we can't answer any questions because we don't see the offender. So it doesn't mean, not that we can't answer any questions, we can't answer any questions about the offender. And that wraps up how we measure